Welcome to St. Peter and Paul Greek Orthodox Church, Glenview, Illinois, on this day, April 6, 2024. And we have our Lenten retreat, and we're pleased to have with us Dr. Jeanne Constantinou, who's speaking on the crucifixion of the King of Glory. So just a couple things before we get started. First of all, welcome to everybody. I think we have multi-state attendance. I know we have people from Indiana. Raise your hands. And I know we have somebody from Wisconsin, some people from Wisconsin, of course, Illinois. Anybody else? Other states represented? California, San Diego. So we'll go till about noon or a little after this morning, and then we'll break for lunch. I forgot to thank the committee that put together all the meal last night and is doing the meal today. So during descent. I also forgot to mention that our this whole Lenten retreat is sponsored by the Kritikos Memorial Lecture Fund with the family of Helen Kritikos, Theodoropoulos, and we thank them for their sponsorship. So, as I mentioned last night, and this will just be a little bit, I apologize for those of you who were here last night, you're going to hear the introduction again, but for our video production purposes, we want to do that. So, as I mentioned last night, Dr. Jeanne had come for our Lenten retreat in St. Paul, Minnesota, approximately 8 years ago, and then with my transition coming here, COVID, all that stuff, trying to forget those few years sometimes in between. But about a year ago, not quite, I ran across a video on YouTube of how many of you know who Eric Metaxas is? He's a very famous Greek evangelical, and he has he's an author. He has quite a following. He has a lectureship series once a year. Remind me the name of the series again? Socrates in the City. And he had a very special guest on last year, and that was Dr. Jeanne. So I recommend, if you haven't seen that, to watch that. It's a very fascinating interview that he does with Dr. Jeanne in front of hundreds of people. And anyways, that brought to mind, I got to bring Dr. Jeanne here for our Lenten retreat, and so that's kind of what led to today. Dr. Jeanne, I'll just read real briefly, has earned her Bachelor's of Art in Religious Studies at the University of San Diego, a Juris Doctorate from Pepperdine University School of Law, a Master's of Arts in Practical Theology from the University of San Diego, a Master of Theology from Holy Cross Seminary and Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from the Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada. She taught biblical studies and early Christianity extensively at Orthodox and non-Orthodox universities and graduate schools of theology, including Hellenic College, Holy Cross. She is the host of Search the Scriptures Live on Ancient Faith Radio. Her most recent books are The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, the one is the topic or subject of our Lenten retreat, and as well Thinking Orthodox, which our men's study group is covering right now, and I highly recommend both books. Presbytera Jeanne is married to Father Costa, and they have one child, Christopher. Presbytera Jeanne spoke last night on conflicts and catalysts, what prompted the arrest of Jesus, and this morning she will be speaking on the hidden history, Judas, the arrest, and the trials. So please help me welcome Dr. Jeanne Constantinou.
Thank you, Father. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Father's got me a little pad here of carpet to stand on because I'm getting old, or I am already old. And I get arthritis in my feet, so sometimes it's hard to stand up. So I'm so happy to be with you again this morning, and we're going to start getting into the meat of some of the events of the Passion Week. And there's so much to talk about. There are a lot of details in the book itself. So I'm just going to hit some of the highlights, and in particular, in this morning session, some of the things that you're hearing in church, particularly about the trials. There were two. There was a Jewish trial. Then there was a Roman trial. Some of the background to these things. And then in the afternoon, some of the very surprising things that you might not know about the connections, the historical connections between Christ's crucifixion and Jewish expectations and prophecies and things like that. So we're going to start with somebody that everybody seems very fascinated by, and this came up last night, and that is the person of Judas. So what do we know about him? Why did he betray Christ? And so, of course, we're going to start with that. In the New Testament, we have a way to identify Judas, the betrayer of Christ, from the other Judas. There were two. It was a very common name. 2 of the 12 had the name Judas. And this is the one who's always mentioned last among the 12, Judas Iscariot, Iskarioth in Greek. And so we don't really know anything about him other than that he was a member of the 12. And we have this discussion or this reference to a not exactly last name, because people didn't have last names then. They were identified by some characteristic or where they were from or something like this. So over the years, people have tried to find some motivation. Why did Jesus betray Christ? And one of the things that was suggested and became very popular was a suggestion that Judas was a revolutionary, like a zealot. And that's because Iscariot sounds a little bit like Sicarii, which is a reference to the zealots who used to carry little daggers in their waistband. Go ahead, Father. Okay, how's that? Can you hear me well enough? Please let me, is that better? Okay. So it became very popular for people to suggest, because somebody, you have to remember something. When you hear explanations about the Bible, first of all, don't take them very seriously, especially on things like the History Channel. They tend to sensationalize them. They want to get a lot of views. YouTube, it's all about the clicks, And also, many of the Bible movies, including the Chosen, are very inaccurate historically. Don't rest your opinions upon these things. So there was somebody, and the other thing you should remember, this is the truth, in academia, you want people to notice you when you're in an academic setting. You want people to talk about your book. You have to say something new. And so one of the things that was proposed some years ago was that Judas was actually a revolutionary who was disappointed in the fact that Jesus wasn't really bringing about the kingdom of God, and so he betrayed the Lord. This, of course, is contrary to all of the evidence in the Bible, which I think is kind of important, don't you? Isn't it important to go by whatever evidence we have in the Bible? So there's really absolutely no basis for that, but it's kind of fascinating. It sort of appeals to our idea of intrigue, that maybe there was this hidden motivation of Judas that we don't really know about. So this is one of the reasons why that kind of took hold. But I'm telling you, I think that is probably absolutely, first of all, it doesn't fit with what we know about the motivation of Christ, and there's nothing to suggest that he was a zealot. And actually, historically speaking, that group didn't exist in the early part of the first century. They came along later. But the word Iscariot, of course, in Greek, Iskariotes or Iskarioth, in Aramaic, we can't really be sure how it would have been pronounced in Aramaic. And so this is the reason why we don't really have confidence in what that word means. Now, it sounds a lot like Sicaria, which means false one, which is very interesting. Is it possible that he was given that moniker later by the disciples after he betrayed the Lord? But it actually sounds more like a village in Judea called Kerioth. Could he be just simply the man from Kerioth? That's possible. But it also sounds like a couple of other words. The word for red in Aramaic, or the word for dyer, a person who dyed cloths. All of these are possible. So we can't really say from his name where he was exactly from or why he had that moniker. The only question then is, why did he betray Christ? Well, all of the evidence in the scriptures is that he did it for money. And the reason why we're always looking for some other explanation is because that doesn't seem to make sense to us. It's hard for us to imagine anyone doing that, but he did. And this is what we see this in the way he approaches the chief priests. So last night I talked about the conflict between the Lord and the scribes and Pharisees. They are the people who come into conflict with Christ in Galilee in the earlier part of his ministry. But during Holy Week, we're usually hearing, especially the later part of Holy Week, we're hearing about the chief priests. They are the ones who orchestrate the arrest and push through the trial, the conviction on the Jewish side and also on the Roman side, and make sure he is executed. These are not Pharisees. These are the chief priests. And last night we spoke about the temple and why they saw the Lord as a threat to the temple. So, contrary to many movies, you should be careful when you watch these movies, because very often they misrepresent it. Sometimes they present Judas as having been tempted by somebody else to betray Christ. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see Judas going to the chief priests on his own initiative and saying, "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?" So he's the one who gets the idea and takes the initiative to go and betray Christ. So we also know from the Gospel of John, John's Gospel is very interesting because it gives us a lot of details, historical details, that he seems to be filling in certain gaps in the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what does John do? John is the one who tells us the story of the anointing of Jesus prior to his passion. And John is the one who tells us that the woman who did the anointing was Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and that the person who objected to the extravagant expense of the ointment was Judas. And then John adds, it's not that Judas cared about the poor, that he said, why wasn't this money used for the poor? But because he was the treasurer of the group, and he used to take money he was embezzling from the disciples, other disciples. That's what John tells us. So, and he was there. So I think we can have confidence in the motivation of Judas being pure greed. And again, this is difficult for us to comprehend because we love the Lord. But for Judas, it was all about the money. Now, Chrysostom asks a lot of wonderful questions in analyzing the person of Judas and his motivation and his actions. One of the things he asks, which is a great question, is why, if he was embezzling, did the Lord allow him to be the treasurer of the group, since he was stealing from the group? Well, Chrysostom says it was to satisfy Judas's insatiable greed. So the other question we could also ask, which is quite amazing to even consider, is why did the Lord even choose Judas to be among the 12, since he knew exactly what he was going to do? And there's the only, I could say, dramatized version of the Bible that I like, which still has mistakes, but I kind of prefer it before all the other movies, is the Franco Zeffirelli miniseries, Jesus of Nazareth. And it shows a scene where Judas meets Jesus for the first time. He introduces himself, wants to be a disciple, and you can see Jesus' face. Oh my gosh, this is the guy. And, and he's like realizing that his time is getting closer. The Lord is. So why would he even allow him to be among the 12? Because the fact that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12, not just any disciple, because we talked about this last night too. Jesus had thousands of followers. The 12 is the inner circle. The 12 were the people that he was training to become responsible for the church. The 12 he sent out to do missions and to practice, and they were healing people. They were casting out demons. They were preaching before Pentecost. All of this they were doing under Jesus's guidance so that they would be ready when the time came for them to take over later. Judas healed people too. We have no reason not to think that. Judas cast out demons too. He did all these things. He saw everything. He heard all of the words of Christ. So why would Christ choose him? And Chrysostom says that it was so that he would have no excuse. He would have no excuse for the betrayal, because if he hadn't been among the 12, he might have said, well, if I had known who he really was. I mean, think about it. Judas was there when Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah. I'm giving you this name, Peter. So Christ affirmed it. So Judas knew all of the secrets, all of the inside information about Jesus that Christ wasn't ready to disclose to other people. He knew it all. So as far as Chrysostom was concerned, that he was given this full opportunity to repent, to change his mind with full knowledge. And I think this is a very profound observation, and he's right about that. So he ends up also, I think it's very interesting to see what Chrysostom says, that Judas, even though he was motivated by money, derived no pleasure from the money, because almost immediately after the Lord is arrested, he has remorse. He's sorry for what he did. And first of all, Chrysostom mentions the fact that we sometimes think that money is the most important thing, or money's going to be the answer to our problems. And he said, look at how Judas fell away from Christ because of greed, and how dangerous the desire for money can be if it could cause this kind of an outcome. But I started to tell you that it was very, very scandalous in the ancient world that Jesus was betrayed by one of his own. And this is something that people would say, pagans and Jews would say, well, obviously Judas knew that Jesus was a fraud, and that's why he betrayed him. So it was a really big deal. And it was very, very distressing for the disciples, the other disciples, the 11, to know that this had happened and that Judas had done this thing. But look at the honesty of the Gospels. So one of the things I hope you will remember, because people will say, well, you can't really trust those works. They were written too late, too long after the time of Christ. They have a religious bias. The Gospels aren't reliable historically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Especially when they talk about things like the miracles. Well, the evangelists were 100% truthful. They didn't hide anything. They didn't hide the fact. They could have said that maybe Jesus was betrayed by one of his own, or they could have just not mentioned how the chief priests came to the garden, because that's what Judas contributes. He takes them to the garden, right? So they could have maybe not mentioned it, but they are very truthful about it, and also about Peter's denial. So what I'm suggesting you think about is the fact that why would they lie about the things that look good and then tell the truth about the things that make the movement and Christ look bad? In other words, the betrayal by Judas. In other words, the Gospels are honest and they are accurate. And we need to have confidence in them, because if somebody simply wanted to put out a puff piece about Jesus and just talk about the miracles and none of the bad things, that's what they would have done. Do you see my point? If the evangelists were honest about what makes the movement, the early Christian movement, look bad, then we can be confident in what they said, that it makes Christ and the disciples look good. You see what I mean? So, at any rate, so Judas almost immediately has remorse about the fact that he had betrayed Christ. And he comes to the temple in this very famous scene to try to prevent what he knows is going to happen, the crucifixion of Christ. Now, when we hear about the scene where he says, I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. And what do they say? What's that to us? We don't care. See to it yourself. In other words, that's not our problem. You did your job. And he's holding the money, the 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. And ironically, Judas's name adds up to the number 30. How does this work? Well, in Hebrew and in Greek, they didn't have numbers like we have the Arabic numerals to signify numbers. So the alphabet signifies the number. So alpha in Greek is 1, and vita is 2, and gamma is 3, and we see this in the books of the church. So the same thing was the case in Hebrew, and Judas adds up to the number 30. So he thought he had sold the Lord, but really he had sold himself, and he had become a slave of the enemy, of the devil. So he's holding the 30 pieces of silver, and he wants to give it back. Why? Why does he want to give it back? He's trying to undo the sale. He sold the Lord. Now, this might seem strange to you, but this was actually part of Jewish law, that a seller could reverse the sale, not the buyer, because if we buy something and we have regrets about it, we might go back and take it back to the store. But it's the opposite in Jewish law. It's the seller who can decide he made a mistake and reverse the sale and get the property back by returning the money, even up to a year after the sale. So let's say you bought a house and it's almost 1 year, and you're afraid that the seller might want to take your house back. Very often, to prevent that from happening, the person who was the buyer, because they said, well, I just have to wait till the year has passed and then the house is mine for sure, the buyer would sometimes go into hiding so that the seller couldn't find them and give them their money back and say, I made a mistake, I want my house back. So in order to avoid that loophole, the law was passed that the seller, if they wanted to undo the transaction, could take the money to the temple. And that's what happened with Judas. Otherwise, why is he bringing the money? He's coming back and saying, I've sinned. Here, take this back. They won't take it back. They won't physically receive it from his hands. So what does he do? He throws it in the temple, not in the treasury, but in the temple. And the coins are flying and rolling all over the place. This is the holy place that he's throwing it. And then they don't know what to do. Of course, they can't take it and put it into the treasury where they had gotten it from, no doubt. The treasury is where all the silver coins are, by which the men used to pay their annual temple tax. So they said this is blood money, which is a very interesting comment, because it shows that they bought the Lord, that this was the price of blood, that it was ill-gotten money, or it was used for a poor purpose. So this is what happened. So now he doesn't succeed, and he can't change what happened to Christ. He was hoping that maybe they would reverse the sale, but that doesn't happen. So now first of all, what is the purpose of Judas? Did Judas have to betray Christ? Was he necessary? So I'm going to throw that out to you. Was Judas necessary? Because people have said this sometimes. And what would you say? Well, Judas had to do it because it was prophesied, right? It was prophesied that he would, or somebody would betray Christ. So did he have to do it? Did he have free will? What do you think? He had free will. Yes, he did have free will. So how would you explain this to somebody who says, but it's a prophecy, so he had to do it? What do you think? Does anybody have any idea what it mentioned? Go ahead. Somebody else could have come along and done it. Anything else? Just go ahead. He didn't need a betrayer. This actually is true also because, yes, in both cases, many people had already attempted to arrest him in the temple, to even kill him. We see this in the Gospel of Luke after Jesus preaches in the synagogue at Nazareth. So there were already attempts to arrest him and even to kill him. They picked up stones in the temple, this is mentioned, to stone him to death. So it's not that somebody had to betray him, but what about the prophecy? I'm going to give you a good way to remember this so that you don't think that the prophecy is what causes the event. Chrysostom says this. He says, it's not that the prophecy causes the event to happen, but that the prophet from the past, because these prophecies were made hundreds of years before Christ. The prophet, seeing what will happen in the future, says what is going to happen. So it's not, the prophecy is not the cause of the event. It's just a foretelling of the event. And here's how you're going to remember that. When you go outside and you see that the sky is dark and the clouds are getting darker and darker, you say it's going to rain. Now, did you cause the rain? Did the rain happen because you saw the clouds? Of course not. You see this and you know what is going to happen, so you say it. It's not because you said it's going to rain that it rains. That's the easiest way to understand how prophecy works, okay? So, go ahead.
How do you avoid then someone saying that's fortune telling?
Okay, fortune telling is when we use black magic. Prophecy was not fortune telling. The prophet was inspired by the Holy Spirit to see into the future and to know what was going to happen. Fortune telling is strictly forbidden, and that goes to, tarot cards and palmistry and astrology and all these things, because that's calling upon evil spirits. And by the way, the spirits don't know the future. The devil does not know the future. Only God knows the future. But the devil and the demons can sort of figure out what you're likely to do based upon your behavior. So that the devil doesn't know the future. So prophecy is not about that. Prophecy is not about just giving some, like the winning lottery numbers or something like that, but inspiration by the Holy Spirit. So, no, Judas did not have to betray Christ. Yes, Jesus would have probably been arrested anyhow. But what Judas does, which is very useful to the chief priests, is that he makes the arrest easier, because he knows where Jesus and the 12 are spending their nights on the Mount of Olives in this little wine press called Gethsemane. Olive press called Gethsemane. So before, when they tried to arrest the Lord, he was surrounded by big crowds, and the people loved him, and they were afraid to arrest him in the middle of the crowd. And so Judas gives them the opportunity to arrest him in the middle of the night when there are no crowds around. So that's what makes Judas's betrayal very useful. Then they're able to put the Lord on trial in the middle of the night and find him guilty, and then he's taken to Pilate by the next morning. Okay, so let's go ahead and just talk about the Jewish trial. So I'm going to read for you the account of the Jewish trial by Matthew, St. Matthew's Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the Jewish trial. John does not have it. John has the trial or the interrogation by Annas, because the Jewish trial was already very well known. John wrote last. So John doesn't mention things that the others mentioned, and yet he includes things that the others left out. So here is Matthew, and here's his account of the Jewish trial. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered. Now, first of all, before we even get to this, because it mentions that they seized the Lord, of course, that's in the garden. And, when we think about the passion of Christ, I think sometimes about the fact that he's waiting in the garden. We all know the story about how he's asking Peter, James, and John to wait with him, and they're just not able to stay awake. They don't really understand what's happening. But the fact that the Lord was under such stress, and how he knew that Judas was coming, and he stayed there. The amount of strength it took for him to just stay put, knowing that he was coming, knowing that he was going to be arrested and crucified. Because some of us, well, all of us would have probably fled, right? Or maybe we would say, well, maybe I'll not end up getting convicted. But he knew exactly what was going to happen. And yet he stayed there and he waited for Judas. And Chrysostom talks about the betrayal by Judas with a kiss, and how the hypocrisy of it, because a kiss is the kiss of friendship. And the fact that Jesus made one last effort, again in the Gospel of John, where when he announces his betrayal, and everybody's saying, well, who would do that? Why? Who is it, Lord? So John asks, who is it, Lord? And he says, it's the person who I dip my hand into the dish with. And so, of course, the Lord took a morsel of bread, puts it in the sauce, and he hands it to Judas. And he's looking at him, right? You know, he knows what Judas is going to do. Judas thinks nobody knows. Jesus knows. He hands it to him, and Judas takes it. Now, when you take a piece of food and you hand it to somebody, this is an act of love. The sharing, right? You don't hand something like this. It's a very intimate thing to eat out of the same plate and then to hand food to somebody. And he does. And Judas takes it. And it says, Satan entered him. And Jesus sees that. He sees on his face that Satan had entered him. Now, it's not because he took the food from Jesus. It's not some kind of weird anti-communion kind of a thing. It's because of his disposition toward evil that he receives it. And instead of receiving a blessing, Satan comes into him. And Jesus just sees that and he says, go do what you have to do. And then Judas goes off into the night. And then Jesus gives final instructions to the disciples, the 11, and telling them what's going to happen, etc. So, of course, they are completely unaware of what Judas was up to. It's quite a remarkable scene when you really think about it. So Jesus is waiting in the garden. He's arrested by the temple guards, not by Romans. Romans have no idea about Jesus. They're unaware of what's going on. This is purely an action by the Jewish leadership for the reasons we talked about last night. So they go to the house of Caiaphas because it is now the middle of the night. Jesus had had this Last Supper with the disciples. He washed their feet. He washed Judas's feet too. He gave the first communion. He gave it to Judas too, and begins to instruct them, beginning with, one of you will betray me. And by now it's already well into the evening. After he finishes instructing the disciples and they leave the upper room and they go down the hill into the Kidron Valley, down below to the other side, to the Mount of Olives, by now it's quite late at night. So the Sanhedrin has gathered at Caiaphas' house. That's not where the Sanhedrin is supposed to gather. Now, it doesn't tell us that it's the Sanhedrin, but we know it is them because this whole event is presided over by the high priest, and that is, at this time, Caiaphas. So let us continue with the reading. So Peter had gone in to follow them. Now here's the trial. The chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Now, let's stop there. So here, of course, it says that the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony to put him to death. Why does Matthew say they were looking for, and it was actually in the imperfect past tense, they were looking for, not they sought once, but it took them a while. They were looking for witnesses. Would they like to have true testimony? Of course, but they couldn't have anything. There was nothing that Jesus had done that really called for the death penalty, and they want him to be put to death. They want the death penalty proclaimed against him. So they're looking for false witnesses. So it says they were looking for false testimony. They found none, though many false witnesses came forward. So there was a parade of witnesses coming through. And this is in the middle of the night in Caiaphas' house. He was, as the high priest, very, very wealthy, had a beautiful house, and they had all gathered there because it's the middle of the night. So what kind of outcome happens for people who are put on trial in secret in the middle of the night? Never good, never good. So they know the outcome. They're going to do whatever they have to do to put him to death because he is a danger. So even though it says council, we know it's the great Sanhedrin for this reason, because there were other tribunals. There were bet dins, which are little councils, little tribunals of 3 judges in towns. Every town had a little court. And then there was lesser Sanhedrins of that in sort of regional courts. And then there was the great Sanhedrin, which had 70 members of the highest ranking. This is the most powerful political body and religious body in all of Judaism. And it was presided over by the high priest. So only the great Sanhedrin had jurisdiction over 3 types of defendants: the king, the high priest, and a false prophet. So they brought Jesus there under the charge of being a false prophet. But who they really had in front of them was the great high priest of heaven and the king of Israel. But here they are, they're meeting to try to find false testimony to put him to death. So why is it that Matthew says there were many false witnesses, but they didn't find any? Well, and then at last 2 came forward. It's for this reason. Because in Judaism, you had to have 2 witnesses that testified to the same exact facts in order to convict someone of a crime. So in this case, there are many witnesses, but they don't agree. And the reason why Jesus hasn't said anything yet, and the reason why he objects to Annas, remember in John's gospel, it tells us that they took him to Annas, and Annas starts asking him questions, and Jesus says, why are you asking me? Why don't you ask the people who heard me? In other words, he's asking for you to follow the Jewish law, which is bring witnesses. In other words, there's no charge. They don't charge you until a charge has been established by 2 witnesses who agree on the same facts. So what happened? What do you think? There's a parade of witnesses. It's the middle of the night. These Jewish leaders are annoyed. They're waiting for somebody to come, waiting for 2 witnesses to agree. So you can imagine what happened. They took a couple of witnesses outside, and they said, listen, you guys, talk to each other, get your facts straight, and then come in and testify. That's the only way, because they don't testify to something that's true. So what do they say? Finally, 2 of them agree on this. And this is what they said. This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So we talked about that last time, the threat to the temple. This now is the charge against Jesus. And what's so terrible about it? Well, actually, the prophet Jeremiah was sentenced to death for predicting the destruction of Solomon's temple. So this was considered a serious charge. It is as though you are saying that God will abandon his people because the temple is the house of God. But that's even not enough, really, for the death penalty. They want much more than that. So after they make this charge, they say the same thing. Now the high priest stands up and he's able to question Jesus. So he says, the high priest stood. Oh, before we get to that, this is what they said, he said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Now, when we hear that, it sounds like something Jesus said. So when I ask people, did Jesus say that? They'll say yes. And the answer is no. So do you remember what he actually said? He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course, John says he's talking about the temple of his body. Now, destroy this temple means that the Jewish leaders were going to be doing the destroying, not him. And the temple to be destroyed would be his own body, which housed the living God. It's the body of the living God on earth. So that's the temple he's talking about. And the people doing the destroying is not Jesus. Jesus never threatened to destroy the temple. So this is not true. The testimony is false. And I think that we know that even when the Lord said this, even though they didn't understand, they did not take that seriously. Because, as I mentioned, it was this huge complex. So nobody could destroy it by themselves and then build it again in 3 days. So the response of the Jewish leaders when Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, I'll build it up again in 3 days. Their response is, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to build it in 3. You see what I'm saying? So they did not consider that a threat. So they're very disingenuous here. But they're looking for something by which they can really charge him with something, and then they're hoping he will incriminate himself, which he does. So Caiaphas stands up and says, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify to you? But Jesus was silent. So, of course, he knows what's going to happen. He knows that they're going to find him guilty somehow. So he doesn't even bother to respond. He's just silent. He could have said, I never said that. What I said was, if you destroy this temple, I will build it up in 3 days. Speaking about myself, he could have done that, but he doesn't. He doesn't even bother. He knows this is the moment. This is why he was incarnate. And so he's going to accept what happened. So he says nothing. He's silent. And then the high priest does something very dramatic. The high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Okay, so now the high priest places Jesus under oath. Jesus is not cooperating. He's not speaking. So in Greek, the word was exorkizo. Orkos or orkizo means I swear. Exorkizo was a legal formula by which somebody could be compelled to testify. It's the opposite of what we have. We have the right against self-incrimination. They had the right to force you to incriminate yourself and to place you under oath, to say the truth by invoking the name of God. In the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Christ. Of course, we've seen them throughout the Gospels asking Jesus, tell us if you're the Christ. Why are you keeping us in suspense? Tell us once and for all. Are you the Messiah? Now, they really knew that he believed himself to be the Messiah, but he never came out and said it. And there was that little custom of him calling himself the Son of Man that they weren't quite sure, what is he getting at? What is he getting at by calling himself Son of Man? It was one of the most common ways. It was the most common way that the Lord referred to himself as the Son of Man. Well, what is the Son of Man? It's not his humanity. Don't ever think it means that. It's actually a sign of his divinity. And why is that? Because the prophet Daniel had had a vision in which he saw the Ancient of Days, that's God, enthroned, and to his right was one like a Son of Man, the Son of Man. And God gave all of his authority to the Son of Man in Daniel's vision. Now, the Jews had no idea what to make with. Who's this person who has the authority of God, who's enthroned next to God? They didn't know. But they thought that maybe Jesus was claiming to be this Son of Man figure from the book of Daniel. Well, sure enough, that's what's happening. So look at what happens next. The high priest said, I adjure you, exorkizo, by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, what's also interesting here is that the words of Christ, of who Christ was, remember that St. Peter was blessed. When Jesus said, who do men say that I am? He said, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the testimony. That's the foundation of the church. On this Petra, on this rock, which is Christ himself, on this, the truth of the statement, I will build my church. And now those very words have come out of the mouth of the high priest himself. Now this is significant because it shows that the high priest also is without excuse. He knows who Jesus is claiming to be. So it is on the basis of that, of his own actual identity, that Jesus is condemned to death. He's condemned to death for being who he is. That's why he is condemned. So now that he has placed him under oath, now the Lord responds. And why does he respond now? Because if he doesn't respond, it's going to be considered an affirmation. Now he might as well respond. And one reason why he does respond is because now he asserts and affirms who he truly is. So they too cannot say, well, we didn't know. All right, so what does he say to them? This is an interesting thing. He says, you have said so. Now, you can't believe how many books I read that people disagreed about what this meant. You have said so. Now, does he say, you have said so, not me? Does it mean, is it a no? Is it a equivocation? Well, you say so. Or is you said so? In other words, yes. Is it yes? Is it no? Or is it a neutral answer? Which one is it? It's a yes. It's a yes. It was Jesus' characteristic way of affirming something. So why doesn't he just say yes? Because he's acknowledging that the truth of who he is has just come out of the mouth of the high priest. It's his way of saying, you have just acknowledged the truth yourself. So where else do we see this? He says something very similar to Pilate. Are you the king of Israel? You said so, or you say so. This is also only in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus announces his betrayal, all the disciples are shocked and they're saying, this is so fascinating to me. They say, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Isn't that amazing that they had such confidence in him that he knew them better than they knew themselves? And then when Judas says, is it me? Jesus says, you said so. Right? That's in Matthew's gospel. That's where you'll find it. If you listen to we have so many gospel readings during Holy Week. So it's a yes. That's a yes. But that's not enough. That Jesus cannot be condemned to death for saying, yes, I'm the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Because there was a custom of calling very holy men sons of God. That's in the Psalms. You are all sons of the Most High. So that's not really enough to bring about the death penalty. Jesus knows they want more. And by the way, being Messiah, claiming to be the Messiah, isn't worthy of death. There were people who came after Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah. As recently as the 1990s, there was a rabbi in New York whom all of his followers said he was the Messiah. Yes, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I just have a question, because I remember you saying this in your writing. It's you who said so.
Yes.
My trouble is that they didn't say so. They asked the question. They didn't affirm. They didn't say.
You say it. Yes.
And they didn't even say, I heard others say that.
Yes.
So I kind of always want to say, hey.
Si ipas, you say, si ipas. The question is, he didn't say, the high priest didn't say that Jesus is the Christ, is what you're saying. It's not an affirmation of an affirmation. Is that what you're saying? Yes. And even Judas. Yeah, but it's a way of saying you have said so by the very question. It's still come out of your mouth. You acknowledged it. To confess something is to say it. It doesn't mean that somebody else had to say it before you. So it's an affirmation. It's two words in Greek. Si ipas is not you said this. You see what I'm trying to say? It's you said. You said. So in English, we supply the rest of the sentence in the translation. So maybe that's what's giving you this idea. So at any rate, he says, you said that. But that's not enough to convict Jesus on something. Is not serious enough, because I said, claiming to be the Messiah does not mean that you're claiming to be the Son of God. And claiming to be the Messiah is not a crime. After all, they were waiting for the Messiah, right? So what leads to the proclamation or the decision to sentence him to death? It's what the Lord says afterwards. And this is what really causes them to proclaim the death penalty. Okay? Because he says, you have said so, or si ipas, you said. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man. That's a reference to himself. Seated at the right hand of power. That's a oblique reference to God. And coming on the clouds of heaven. This is a reference to that Daniel vision in which he saw the clouds of heaven and the power, and that's the way of saying God. And next to him, the Son of Man. So this is an absolute statement of divinity. It doesn't sound that way to us, right? You'll see the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven. It sounds kind of pretty, like Jesus is drawing a nice picture. But it's a claim of divinity. And there's no mistaking that. So the Lord knows what's going to happen. It's not enough for him to confess that he's the Messiah or even the Son of God. It is with these words, this description, that you will see me, the Son of Man. He's referring to himself, sitting next to God and coming on the clouds of heaven. That is enough to claim divinity. And this is when the high priest tears his robes and says he is blasphemed. Why do we need witnesses? They don't need any more witnesses. This is exactly what they were hoping for. They were hoping that Jesus would, in fact, implicate himself in the blasphemy, that he would provide the testimony that they needed to say that he deserves death. And this is what they all said, and this is when the beating begins. It says they spat in his face and struck him, and they slapped him, etc. So, now, it doesn't end there. It does not end there, because they could have, by Jewish, we could say, tradition, stoned him to death. That's the usual penalty for blasphemy. Now we know that the Romans alone had the right of the sword. The Romans had removed from the Jews, as their occupiers, the right to put anyone to death. That was reserved for the Romans. And however, Jesus is in their custody, right? It's the middle of the night. They could have taken him outside to the courtyard or maybe to some field someplace or the long ride in the country and, tied him to some heavy weights and thrown him in the river. They could have done a lot of things, right? They could have killed him if they wanted to. They clearly believe he deserves death. He's uttered blasphemy by claiming to be equal to God. So they know he deserves death, but they don't want to kill him that way. They want the Romans to do it, and this is where the Romans come in. Now, why did they want him to be killed by the Romans? A couple of reasons. First of all, they don't want responsibility for it because he's very popular. The people love him, and they believe he's the Messiah. Number two, they want Jesus completely discredited. And the best way to do that is for him to die by crucifixion because it shows that God cursed him. Rather than being the Messiah sent by God, in fact, it's something else. He is the one who is cursed by God because they have this idea. And in academic circles, we call that Deuteronomistic thinking. And it just means this, that whatever good happens to you because God approves of you. God has blessed you. And conversely, the bad things that happen is because God is punishing you. Well, there's nothing worse than being crucified. So, if he were to be crucified, this would prove to the people that Jesus cannot have been the Messiah. He's a false prophet. All of his claims about himself, everything the people thought is not true, because otherwise he wouldn't be crucified. And actually, that is still the number one reason today why Jews do not believe that Jesus is a Messiah, because he died on the cross. It's such a shameful death, a painful death. It was proof positive that he could not be the Messiah. So there was a tremendous incentive for them not to kill him themselves, but to take him to the Romans, to have him publicly executed. But it would not be as easy as they thought. So let's go ahead and turn to the Roman trial. So they finally, after many attempts to find enough witnesses, they get 2 witnesses, they level the charge, Jesus admits to it, and they decide he's deserving of death. By now, it's still late in the night, but still, we could say early in the morning of Friday. And they have to take him to Pilate, the governor. So let's talk about Pilate for a minute. Pilate, as the governor of Judea, had supreme authority over the province. And in this case, it's Judea and this area to the north, which is called Samaria. And as the governor of the province, he came to the province with what's called the imperium. And that is all the powers of the emperor. It's as though he is the emperor. He's representing the emperor for sure, has all the powers. That means power of life and death over everyone in this province. And Pilate was there as governor of Judea from the year 26 until the year 36. A long time, and it wasn't easy. The Jews were not easy people to govern because they were a little bit strange. They didn't have any idols. They only believed in one God. They were very stubborn in terms of their religious sensibilities. We do know about Pilate from other writings of the period, especially Flavius Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian who tells us some stories about Pilate. Now, Pilate, along with other Roman governors, their usual tenure was for 2 years. You would go to a province as the governor for 2 years, and then you'd come back to Rome. Now, he was there 10 years, which tells you something. He was very effective. In other words, Rome was not unhappy with his job, and he was able to maintain order, and also he was getting something out of it. Because nobody's going to stay in Judea when they've come from Rome, okay, and just spend all your time here in Judea dealing with these difficult people. So why did somebody like Pilate? Pilate's not at the highest level of Roman aristocracy. He's one step down. He was at the equestrian level of Roman aristocracy. The highest are the senators. So he was still climbing the social ladder. And one way to accomplish that was to become a governor and also become very wealthy. So how did these governors become wealthy? Well, primarily through bribery. And you had to appoint a lot of different people to different positions as tax collectors or toll collectors. And of course, there's the appointment of high priest, which they changed to being an annual thing so that they would get an annual bribe, very conveniently. So Pilate is very familiar with these people. He's already been there. This is now the year 33. He's already been there for several years. He has to work together with the members of the Sanhedrin. They're the ruling body of the Jews. They're responsible for all of their religious decisions. And by the way, Pilate and other Romans are happy to let the people rule themselves as much as possible. One of the big time constraints and we could say demands on the time of a Roman governor was to hear court cases. That's one of the things that they did. And sometimes they would have to appoint, if there were lots of cases, they would have to appoint people to go to other cities and hear them. Or sometimes governors would travel to different cities and then they would hear court cases. And so this was very, very time consuming. At any rate, he's accustomed to this. What I'm trying to tell you is that Pilate is accustomed to hearing court cases, to holding a trial, interrogating witnesses. This is something he did on a regular basis. This was not something different. So it is now very, very early in the morning, and all the Gospels tell us that Jesus appeared before Pilate on Friday morning. So here is the account, and this is from John's Gospel, which has the longest account of the trial before Pilate, and we will see what happened. And they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early, very early. Now, why was it early? Because the Roman workday was from 6 a.m. to noon, and then they were off. That was a typical. It works out very well in a hot climate, but this is how they used to work. So they knew that Pilate would be ready and working, before dawn. So they took him to the praetorium. Now, there's a lot of discussion about where this was. Where is the praetorium? Because many people assume that Pilate would have stayed when he was in Jerusalem. By the way, he wasn't in Jerusalem most of the time. Most of the time he was at the provincial capital, which was Caesarea Maritima, a beautiful Roman city that was built on the seashore by Herod the Great in order to thank Augustus Caesar, for letting him stay on as king. Okay, because what happened was Herod the Great had become king when Julius Caesar was running the empire. And then after the assassination of Caesar and the civil war that broke out among the Romans, he was looking at all the players and trying to position himself, trying to figure out who is going to win this war for power after the assassination of Julius Caesar. And he chose Antony and Cleopatra. So Herod the Great supported Antony and Cleopatra. And there was the fortress there overlooking the Temple Mount was called the Antonia Fortress after Antony. So, he was a politician, Herod the Great. Now, of course, we know what happened. Antony and Cleopatra both die, and the person who actually becomes the first emperor is Augustus Caesar, Octavian. Remember from your high school history, ancient history days. So I don't even know if they teach that anymore. Probably not. He becomes Augustus Caesar. Now Herod the Great is in trouble. This is long before the birth of Christ. So what does he do? He goes there and he says, Augustus Caesar, you know how loyal I was to Antony and Cleopatra? Well, I'll be as loyal as that to you. And guess what? Augustus, to his credit, keeps him on there. And so in gratitude to that, Herod the Great built this magnificent Roman city by the sea called Caesarea, after Caesar, Maritima, by the sea. And it was spectacular. That's the Roman capital. That's where Pilate spent most of his time. They had the administrative buildings there. They had an amphitheater. That's where Paul preached to Herod Agrippa when he was in prison there. And they had, of course, lots of Roman temples and baths and all the accoutrements of Roman life. Jerusalem was no fun. Nobody wanted to be in Jerusalem. So it was a religious city, all right? So he was there for one reason, because of Passover. And Pilate knew that if there was going to be any revolt against Rome, it would happen during Passover. There was always a danger because the city swelled from a population of about 50,000 to probably 200 to 250,000, with everybody coming to Jerusalem for Passover. And whenever you have a large crowd and you have a lot of religious fervor, and especially because at Passover time, they were remembering their liberation from slavery in Egypt, there was a high probability that a riot could break out or that this would lead to a revolt. So Pilate would always come for these, what they called pilgrim festivals, especially Passover, and he would come with troops. So I started this out by saying, where's the praetorium? So many people theorize that he was staying because there was no more king in Judea. Herod the Great had been king over the whole region, but now his son, Herod Antipas, is king in Galilee, not in Judea. So people theorize that Pilate was at Herod the Great's palace, and that there was a place where they brought Jesus in the nicest neighborhood of Jerusalem. That's where Caiaphas' house was. That's where they took him. I don't think that's right. I think that they took him to the Antonia fortress because that's where Pilate was, even if he spent the night sometimes at Herod the Great's palace. And there's a reason for that as I go on to tell you what happened here. So when there's a kind of a riot that breaks out with St. Paul, I don't know if you know about this, when he's in the temple, the soldiers from the Antonia fortress, it was above the Temple Mount. The temple was surrounded by a big platea, a big square called the Court of the Gentiles, where large crowds of people could gather. So the Romans were always there looking down on the crowd for crowd control. So when they see this breaking out with St. Paul, they ran down there immediately and took him up. And I think that this is what happened. Excuse me. Jesus was taken there to the praetorium, and the praetorium, I'm telling you, was in the Antonia fortress. Another reason why that's denied is because there's a stone pavement. We say that Jesus was standing on this lithostrotos, stone pavement, and people used to go to Jerusalem and they would point to that pavement and say that's where Jesus was standing. But we know that that was built by Hadrian, which is in the 2nd century. But just because that's not the actual pavement doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't there before the pavement was there, if you follow my thinking. Okay, and there's reasons why I think it's impossible that he would have been tried by Pilate up in the upper city where there was just crowds milling about on the street. The crowds, in this case, would be by the Temple Mount, and there's a reason for that. So they take him to the praetorium. It was early. So how early? 6 a.m., 7 a.m., as early as possible, because they're busy men. This is the day before Passover. Passover will begin at sunset. And the day before, they have all kinds of things to do at the temple. They're going to sacrifice thousands and thousands of lambs. So they want to get this matter out of their hands, hand him over to Pilate. It's early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So if you entered under the roof of a pagan, it would make you defiled. You would be religiously unclean. And these are all priests, remember. These are the chief priests. And so they don't want to be exempt from eating the Passover or taking part in their duties in the temple. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Now, notice that Pilate does not know who Jesus is. One of the charges against the evangelist by modern Bible scholars is that Pilate, the portrayal of Pilate, that he was reluctant to crucify Jesus, is not true, because we know about Pilate. He was a tough bird. He'd have to be. And so they say that the evangelist made up this idea that Pilate wasn't really he really wanted to get Jesus off, because, this is their theory, that the church didn't want to make the Romans mad. Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. The evangelists knew what happened. The Romans were persecuting the Christians anyhow, but not because the Christians were saying that Jesus was put to death by the Romans. That would make no difference. There's a reason why Pilate was reluctant to put Jesus to death, even though he had ordered the executions of many people. There's a reason. And the Gospels are perfectly accurate. But that's what most Bible scholars say. I've never read, and I'm not trying to say something special about me, but I've never read anybody explain this in any commentary. Because there's this idea that since Pilate behaved this way with other people, he behaved this way. In other words, he quickly decided someone was guilty and sentenced them to death. That the gospel readings, the gospel accounts are not accurate. So, another thing that many people will say is that Pilate must have heard about Jesus. Where is the evidence of that? And why would Pilate have heard about Jesus? Just think about it. First of all, he doesn't know who Jesus is. The other thing is sometimes they say the Romans went and arrested him because it refers to the spida. The guards went in the middle of the night to Gethsemane, and a spida is a cohort of 600 men, okay? Now, it was in other words, a tenth of a legion. And so there are some commentators who said it took 600 men to arrest Jesus. It could have been 6,000 men. It could have been 6 million men. If Jesus hadn't agreed to go with them, he, as God, would not have gone. It wasn't 600 men. How could it be a secret? How could they silently walk through the streets of Jerusalem down the Kidron Valley up to the Mount of Olives? 600 men, 1,200 feet stomping in the middle of the night? Come on. It's ridiculous, some of the things that they say, okay? And everybody thinks they're so smart. So here's I'm serious. We have to be very careful about making certain presumptions that are not supported. So it's a temple guard that arrests Jesus, not the Romans. The Romans never heard of him. Never heard of him. Now maybe you're thinking about the centurion, right? The centurion who's got the sick. Where is he at? Galilee. The centurion is in Galilee, where Jesus was preaching most of the time. We're talking here about Pilate. Now, they've never heard of Jesus. They said, well, he must have heard of Jesus. Don't ever listen to anybody who says, well, that must have happened. Well, why? Why would he hear of Jesus? Where was Jesus preaching? In Roman temples? Was he preaching to Romans? No, in synagogues, at the temple, in houses of Jews, in Aramaic. Okay? Well, what about the big crowds? This is a big fallacy about currently with the chosen. They're showing the Romans all concerned. No, the Romans were not concerned. They weren't involved at all. This is the first that they've heard about Jesus. Well, we must have been worried about the crowds that were gathering. No, because they were peaceful gatherings. Okay, and Jesus never fomented rebellion. That's the reason for the challenge about the coin. That's the reason why they ask him, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? They're hoping that he will say no, so they have a political charge to bring him to the attention of Rome. Do you see my point? Because what would have happened? If Jesus is just attracting large crowds of people, and what's he telling them, by the way? Love your enemies? Okay, that's really very, politically difficult. He's saying love your enemies and things like this. The reason why is, let's say somebody was concerned that there are large crowds. Now remember, Pilate's a tough guy. So there's large crowds of people, and they're listening to this rabbi preach. So what are they going to say? Pilate, there's something you should know. Well, what is it? There's this rabbi, and he's preaching. And so? Well, there's a lot of people. Get out of here. I'm a busy man. Do you see what I'm saying? So even when you listen to theologians and Bible scholars, that's why I tell you, don't listen to the History Channel, these things like this, because you don't know how to analyze this information, okay? Even though it seems to, what a lovely ringtone. Like we're in heaven. We're in heaven. There's a harp. There was this heavenly sound. It seems to make sense. Their arguments make sense. Pilate must have heard of Jesus, right? That Pilate would never have been so, so eager to release Jesus? It makes sense. And this is why in the church we don't use human reasoning in analyzing the Bible or in our theology, because it's often wrong, even though it seems to make sense to us. So we haven't gotten very far in our trial. Pilate says, what accusation do you bring against this man? He's never heard of Jesus. He doesn't know who he is. If he's the one who had sent the guards, because that's what it would take, Pilate to send 600 men to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus. Obviously, that's not the case, because he's surprised. It's the day before, it's the morning of, it's the day of preparation in the morning. Now, what is their answer? This is the first mistake. Almost a fatal mistake. These are the Jewish leaders. They answered him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over to you. An evildoer. That's not a crime. Okay, it's true. It's not a crime in America either. That's not a crime. So what does Pilate say? Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Can you see that they are stating a religious kind of objection to Jesus, not even a religious crime? He says, take him and judge him by your own law. They had the right to judge him by their own law. He doesn't know. They already have. They found him guilty. Okay, but they want him dead. Okay, and so then they say this. The Jews said, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. This was to fulfill the word which Jesus had spoken, to show by which death he was to die. So Pilate says, look, you handle your own religious problems. But notice that as soon as they say, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him. They didn't allege treason. They didn't allege a Roman crime. So Pilate, being a representative of the Roman state, cannot just say, well, if you say he's guilty of something, he's an evildoer, take him and crucify him. He has to follow procedures too. He had to fill out reports. He had to keep records. No, seriously, think about it. He's not some maniac out there just killing people. There has to be a reason for him to bring a charge. There has to be a violation of Roman law. This is a Roman tribunal. Do you understand? Okay, so right away they've shown that they have nothing. That's why he's skeptical to begin with. And he knows these people. All right, he knows them. He works with them. So on the one hand, he knows he actually says that he knows that they were jealous of him, but he also knows that he has to work with them to keep the peace, because his job is at stake too. So by now Jesus is inside the praetorium. It doesn't tell us what they were telling Pilate as they stood outside. It's amazing. They don't want to be defiled, but they're bringing an innocent man, as far as Christendom would say, to be executed, right? They don't think he's innocent. Pilate enters the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Now, what do we see from this? That outside they found a charge, a Roman charge that carries the death penalty. This man claimed to be the king of the Jews. Now it switches from evildoer to a Roman charge, and that's treason. He claimed to be king of the Jews. And we know this from Pilate's first question. Are you the king of the Jews? By the way, that the whole movie, the trial, the Passion of the Christ, oh my God, so many mistakes, so many historical mistakes, theological mistakes, I can't begin to tell you. When they arrest Jesus, I don't know if you remember this scene, because they're in a big room. It's sort of like the temple, but you don't exactly know where it is. They're in this big room, and this is supposed to be the trial before the Sanhedrin, and Jesus is surrounded basically by a mob. It doesn't look like a trial at all. This Jewish guy comes and says, are you the king of the Jews? And by the way, at that trial is Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene and Peter, all the disciples are all watching this. What kind of nonsense is this? That's not what happened. Okay, there was this meeting of the Sanhedrin. They went through a process. They were questioning him. And they didn't ask him, are you the king of the Jews? The Jews would never ask Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? They wanted to know if he was the Messiah. You see what I'm saying? And this is just so basic. Big mistake. So don't get your theology or your Bible from the movies. Just don't do that. Okay, my word of advice. Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Look at what Jesus answers. This is important. Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Now, why does he say this? Okay, Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? Now, why does Jesus say, have you heard this elsewhere? To show that Pilate had not heard of Jesus before. You see what I'm saying? Jesus says to Pilate, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about me? He says, wait a minute, I'm not Jewish. I've never heard of you before. That's what he's saying here. And it's the reason why that's significant is because, the Romans were very paranoid about rebellion, about treason. There's not a lot of Romans, and there's a whole lot of Jews. And so if a revolt was to break out, that would be very difficult. They couldn't control it. They couldn't immediately put down the Jewish revolt. And that's what happened when they finally did revolt against the Romans. They were winning for the first couple of years, okay? So Jesus is pointing out to Pilate, if there was a problem, if he really was pretending to be the king or claiming to be the king, he would have troops, right? And Pilate would have heard of this because, believe me, Pilate and other kings, they were very paranoid. So they were always looking out for treason, and they had informants who loved to go running to Pilate or somebody like that, Herod, and say, this guy's against you. This guy is speaking against you. This is what they did. They always had people who were watching for this sort of thing. So Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your nation, the chief priests, handed you over. What have you done? Again, so you see, he's never heard of Jesus. Jesus answers, my kingship is not of this world. If my kingship were of the world, my servants would fight that I might not be handed over to the Jews, but my kingship is not of this world, which is right, because where's the army if he's claiming to be king? Now, on what basis did they say he claimed to be king? We talked about this yesterday. The entry into Jerusalem. So this is not only the catalyst for his arrest, it's one of the reasons why Pilate does what he does. Because as Jesus came into Jerusalem on Sunday, there were people who were shouting, Hosanna, King of Israel, Hosanna to the Son of David. So this is the reason why the Jewish leaders said this guy claimed to be the king, because he didn't say, no, I'm not the king. He accepted the acclamation of the crowd. So he says, my kingship is not of this world. And he's right, because if he really was trying to get earthly power, he would have an army, right? So Pilate says, so you are a king. Jesus said, you say that I'm a king. For this I was born, for this I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? Again, I'm a busy man. You're here talking philosophy to me. What is truth? I mean, this is the philosophical kind of stuff. What is truth? He doesn't wait for the answer, just leaves. At this, he went out to the Jews and told them, I find no crime in him. But you have a custom. Now, look what's going on here. Pilate is ready to release Jesus. He's not a threat. He's never heard of him. If he was amassing an army, believe me, that news would have come back to Pilate. He knows he's not a threat. Now, here's where people say this is not historically accurate, because Pilate was very quick to put people to death. Yes, if they were guilty. Are you saying that Pilate is just going to put anybody to death, even when there's no basis for it? I don't think so. But there's something else that nobody seems to ever take into consideration. How is Jesus standing before Pilate? Now, Pilate, as I said, if you're brought before Pilate, what are you going to do? What would any of you have done? Please, I'm not guilty of anything. You'd be begging. You'd be asking, let me have an orator. Let me prepare a defense, right? Let me call my friend to give you a bribe. Something. Seriously. That's what people did before Pilate, accused of a capital offense. Jesus is standing there perfectly calm, speaking to him, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate gets it. He knows Jesus is not a threat. Now, what's with Barabbas? He comes out and says, I find no crime. He's ready to release him, but he doesn't. But you have a custom that I should release to you one man at Passover. Will you have me release for you this king of the Jews? And they said, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Now, let's talk about that. Why does Pilate, this is very strange. Why does Pilate suggest Barabbas? Barabbas, it says listis, robber. He's not like a regular highway robber. He's a revolutionary. He really did kill people. The last person Pilate wants to release is Barabbas. Barabbas really is a threat to Rome, not Jesus. So why does he suggest it? because he, as I mentioned, he has to work with these Jewish leaders. And it will be embarrassing to them that they already found him guilty and sentenced him to death. If Jesus is released, it's embarrassing to them. So by suggesting the release on this basis, the prisoner release at Passover, it didn't happen every Passover, but it did some Passovers, it gets them off the hook. They can say to the people, yes, Jesus really is a blasphemer and an evildoer, but Pilate let him off. Do you see? He's thinking about what will help them save face. It would be embarrassing for them to just release Jesus like that. So he suggests the prisoner release. You want him or you want Barabbas? Now, I think that he, having been told by the Jewish leaders about the huge crowds that welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, expected the crowd to shout for Jesus. That's the only reason he took this risk, you see? But that's not what happened. And why not? Well, we're going to get to this. So now they say, no, we don't want him. These are the Jewish leaders. We want Barabbas. Now, then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Now, this was considered the worst punishment short of crucifixion itself. A scourging is not like a whipping. So sometimes you see in the movies, Jesus gets whipped, and there's like this clean line across his back from the smooth leather. This is a scourging was like a whip down at the base. It spread out. It had about 8 or 9 different ends and on the whip. And at the end of each of these strands of leather was a piece of metal, sharp metal. So when the person was struck with it, the metal would dig into their back. And then when it was yanked out, it took a piece of flesh. How many lashes did Jesus get? We don't know. Okay, trick question. You know, people say 39. In the movies, they show 39. But actually, the 39 is a Jewish rule under Jewish law. There's no limit for the Romans. Okay, that's a Jewish law. So we don't really know. But it had to be a very severe scourging. Okay, because he's extremely weak after this. And he couldn't carry his cross to the site of crucifixion. So this was a very, very severe scourging. Now, why does Pilate do this? I mean, if he knows that Jesus is innocent, why do it? He's trying to save his life, ironically. He knows they're upset with Jesus, and he's hoping that this will be enough so that they will be satisfied. And it's a very strange way to try to save somebody's life by torturing them in the extremely painful way. But people did survive scourging. Paul was scourged, okay? So this is what he's trying to do now. So after he's scourged, of course, we have the mocking, the crown of thorns, and they bend their knee to him, say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they strike him. And then Pilate brings him back and says, he went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no crime in him." So all of this is happening, I'm saying, at the Praetorium, which is by the temple, on the Temple Mount, not in the upper city. Jesus comes out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate says, "Behold the man." In other words, look at him. Look at this. Look at this man. And he's standing there and he's dripping blood. He's got the crown of thorns. And it's this gory kingship. And for some reason, when the Jews see him, they're not satisfied with that. They see the blood. They want him dead. That they're not satisfied by watching him in this state. When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate is disgusted with them. He says, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no crime in him." He's not saying, "Go ahead." It's like somebody, when you try to do something for somebody and they're unappreciative, and you say, "You do it yourself." He didn't mean that he found him guilty. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you see how this? Now, Jesus answered him, the Jews answered him. Now, why is he reluctant? I told you, because of Jesus' demeanor, his calmness, his confidence before Pilate, and the fact that Pilate had not heard anything about Jesus, any revolt being led by Jesus. He really believed Jesus to be innocent. So he says, "I find no crime in him." The Jews answered him and said, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he has made himself Son of God." When Pilate heard these words, he was the more afraid, and entered the Praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And Jesus did not answer. And then Pilate, now think about this. He's at, right now, this is one reason. Not only is Jesus very strange to Pilate, not begging for his life, not asking for time to prepare a defense, not denying that he did anything wrong, just calm and collected in front of the most powerful man in the province. And that was strange in itself. Now they're saying he claims to be the Son of God. Now, in Pilate's mind, that's really possible, because we know about the mythologies of the Greeks and the Romans, that they really believed that gods came from Olympus and looked like human beings, and if you disrespected them, what happened to you? You know the story of Arachne and Athena, right? She became a spider. She said, I'm a better weaver than Athena, so Athena turned her into a spider. So this is what happened, and the Romans, Pilate believes this. This is his world. We can look at that and say, oh, that's kind of silly. Not to an ancient Roman or ancient Greek. That's reality. The gods came to earth, and by golly, if you treat them badly, you're going to suffer, buddy. That's what he's afraid of. And he says, where are you from? Now remember, Jesus said, my kingship is not of this world. He's not answering. Jesus is not defending himself. And now Pilate gets annoyed because he's not used to that. And he says, don't you know I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you? And Jesus says, you would have no power if it wasn't given to you from above. Now Pilate is really frightened. He doesn't want anything to do with this. I'm leaving out the thing about his wife. That's in Matthew's gospel. We're reading here from John's gospel. Doesn't want anything to do with this. He wants to release him. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him. Now, why is it that he ends up crucifying him? But the Jews cried out, oh, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat on the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha, Lithostos, and it was a day of preparation. Now, before we get to that last part, when Pilate heard these words, you're not a friend of Caesar, then he knows there's nothing he can do. He ascends the judgment seat to pronounce him the death penalty on Jesus. What's going on there? Again, this is the behind-the-scenes stuff that you wouldn't know, but Pilate knew what happened there. What does it mean you're not a friend of Caesar? Friend of Caesar was a title given to the most eminent men of Rome, and Pilate may have had that title. And they were favored by the Caesars. And they were like advisors to the Caesars. By the way, that was a custom that the Romans got from the Greeks. The Greeks also had the friends of the king, kind of a court or council of advisors. Now, several months before this, one of Tiberius Caesar's closest advisors, Aelius Sejanus, was convicted of treason and sentenced to death by his friend Tiberius. Because not only Tiberius was notoriously paranoid, but all emperors were, because there was always somebody who wanted to kill you, all right, then to become the next emperor. So by saying this, look, the Jewish leaders know all about politics in Rome. And this is a threat. They're blackmailing Pilate. They're saying, if you don't execute him, you're no friend of Caesar. And what they're implying is that they're going to tell Tiberius. And Pilate will be called to Rome, probably be replaced, because he will be considered by Pilate. They will say, listen, Tiberius, we brought this guy who claimed to be king in front of your man Pilate. Pilate didn't do anything about it. That's the end for Pilate, and he knows it. So they have blackmailed him into doing something he didn't want to do. He's afraid that Jesus might be a god, but he also knows that he's in a difficult place. He has no choice. So what does he do? He ascends to the judgment seat, and it's now the day of preparation. That's Friday, about the 6th hour. There's a lot of significance in that. And he says to the Jews, very sarcastically, behold your king. Because he's dressed in the robe and the crown, and he's mocking them. He's mocking them, and he's furious because they're forcing him to do something he doesn't want to do. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate says, shall I crucify your king? Look at the sarcasm there. We have no king but Caesar. That's blasphemy. Remember? That's what they were trying to accuse Jesus of with the coin. That's blasphemy. Only God is king, but they are so determined to put him to death, they will say that. And then he handed them over to be crucified. Now, about the 6th hour, we'll talk about what the meaning of the 6th hour after lunch, okay? So now it's time. I'm sorry I went over a little bit, but it's time for lunch, and we'll continue the story afterwards. Yes, Father? Questions? Oh, we have time for questions. Very good. Oh, they're going to get lunch ready. We have time for questions. Yes, Andrew.
Quick question.
Yes.
During that time, I know the Byzantine Empire, which the Romans were in control of, they spoke Greek.
Yes.
Now,
He said that they spoke Greek. Pilate would have been speaking Greek.
during the tribunal, during the communication,
Yes.
with Aramaic, Latin, or
Aramaic. Okay, what they would have been speaking to Pilate in Greek.
Okay.
Greek was very
Was communicating?
probably yes. Now, how much Aramaic did Pilate know? Maybe he knew some.
Right.
But first of all, Jesus was from Galilee. Let's remove the idea of the fact that he's God and he could speak any language. Jesus grew up in Galilee, which was a very mixed area, and most people were bilingual up there because they did, sort of business and things with Greeks. There was a lot of Greek spoken even in Jerusalem. That was the common language of the day, just like English is common today. Anywhere you go in the world, there are people who can communicate with you in English. That's how it was. So again, this is a Mel Gibson movie. Jesus is talking to Pilate in Latin. No way, no way, no way. He would have thought that the question would have been, how do you know Latin? No, he would have spoken to him in Greek, absolutely. Yes. Any other questions or comments? Yes, back there.
Jewish libraries have all kinds of records of important and non-important events and people. Why are there no records of what these scribes were?
Okay, well, you said Jewish libraries have records of events and people. Why are there no records of what?
What happened in this one?
Of what happened in this? Because you said the most important, it wasn't important to them. First of all, a lot of records that actually did exist. For example, of the genealogy of Christ, there were records in the Jewish temple. A lot of they did keep records. A lot of those were destroyed when the temple caught fire. But also, there are references to Jesus in Jewish writings, only they're very negative because they don't consider him to be the Messiah. So they do mention him, and he's also mentioned by Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who talks about Jesus and how he was put to death by the Jewish leaders and how he was a wonder worker. So we do have records, but they would never have said anything positive about it. They would have said the worst things about him, and that's what we have. Is that what you were asking? Well, look, if there were Roman records of this trial, which there may well have been, we don't have them. We don't have most of the writings from antiquity. It's been estimated that we have right now only 10% of all the documents that existed in antiquity. We don't have most of the writings. Think about it. Why would they keep it? See, we look back and say, oh, this was very important. They would have kept it. But it was a long time before the Christian movement really had enough people to be considered an important movement. It was just a little sect in Judaism that everybody expected to die out. Nobody's going to keep their records. Why would they keep their records? If they had any. You see what I mean? The Gospels, by the way, are the record. That's a historical record, and that needs to be taken seriously. Yes?
Who exactly were the people that maybe Pilate was speaking to in the
Oh, yeah, thank you. I meant to talk about that because I mentioned this, why this took place. Why did they shout for him to be crucified in the crowd? Why I believe that this happened on the Temple Mount in the Antonia fortress. Why do people shout for Barabbas when Jesus was so popular? This is why I don't think Pilate is in the upper city in the elite neighborhood at Herod's palace. He's at the Antonia fortress above the Temple Mount. This whole thing is being orchestrated by the chief priests. When they know that there's going to be a question, is it Barabbas or Jesus? Jesus is being scourged. They ran to the temple and got their friends to come back and shout for Barabbas. Now, why do we say this? Because one of the popular things priests and pastors like to say is that they shouted for Jesus, he's the Messiah, on Sunday, and on Friday, they shouted for him to be crucified. Who would do this? That's not what happened. This is not the same group. This group and one of the other evangelists hints at this. This group that shouts for Barabbas was generated by the chief priests, and their place of power was the temple. So they only had to go like across the street, for you literally, a few hundred feet to the temple to get people to shout for Barabbas. And by the way, that wouldn't be hard to do because Jesus is the one who had cleansed the temple and threatened everybody's livelihood, remember? So this is not a random crowd on the streets of Jerusalem, okay? But Pilate had no idea about that because he talked about how they had told him how popular Jesus was and how he's a threat. There was a big parade and they welcomed him in. Pilate must have thought that they would ask for Jesus and he would be off the hook. But that's not what happens because the chief priests are determined to fill the crowd with people who will shout for Barabbas. Because it's the day, it's the morning of Passover. Now, what are you doing in the morning when there's going to be a big feast that starts in the evening? This is like Christmas Eve. Nobody's just milling around with nothing to do. You're busy. Ordinary people were down below in the city. The temple is up here on the mountain. Most people were down below getting ready for the Passover. It's not some random crowd of people. You see? That's why. Thanks for asking the question. Yes?
Wasn't there a gap between those two pilot interchanges where they went to Herod?
Oh, yes, that's mentioned. Was there a gap between in the interrogation? Yes, but only Luke talks about that. When Pilate finds out he's from Galilee, he sends him to Herod, who is also in the city for the feast. And he sends Herod, he's hoping that, because Jesus is basically a citizen of Galilee, not of Judea. So Pilate does not want to be bothered with this. He's busy trying to get the troops ready to maintain order over this huge crowd that's going to assemble on the Temple Mount. So he's hoping to pass that off. And he figures that Herod, being nominally Jewish, would know the issues better, and that Herod, if he knew that Jesus was a problem, he would be in the position to put him to death. And Herod doesn't, of course. He just wants to see Jesus do a miracle. He doesn't see Jesus as a threat because, and this is the other reason why Pilate wants to release Jesus. Herod would know if Jesus was a political threat, right? But he doesn't. Instead, he just has fun with him. He dresses him up in fancy robes and sends him back. But that's a good point, yes. I didn't mention every detail. Yes?
So you mentioned that Pilate had been there for a long time already, 7 years.
Yes.
Rome must have recognized him as being effective in that region. So the threat that he's no friend of Caesar, he must have known that this wouldn't be entirely effective, but he's like, it feels like he's relying on these people to help him.
Yeah, well,
He's relying on them to accomplish what it is.
the person who was executed by Tiberius was the best friend of Tiberius, Aelius Sejanus. And when somebody is convinced that people close to you might turn against you and be part of this conspiracy, it would be very easy for the Jewish leaders to say that Pilate is not faithful, not loyal to you. And Tiberius is not going to take a chance with that. And he doesn't care. So, no, it was a real threat. So Pilate could sort of rely on that, but then he's taking his chances. If it could be Jesus or it's going to be him. But definitely he would be recalled to Rome to answer for that. And so why do that? So if it's going to be Jesus or him, he's going to choose himself. Okay, Father, you want to pray for the food? Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna do something after the prayer. I don't know if you've done this before, Jeannie, but I'll invite everybody to come forward. We'll do a group photo with everybody who's here, and then we'll proceed to eat the meal that's been prepared for us. And thank you again to everybody who's helping provide our food and refreshments today. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Christ our God, bless the food and drink of thy servants. Bless also our fellowship and learning on this day. Bless our speaker, Evgenia. And we thank you for all the good gifts that you've given to us, especially during this time of the journey to Pascha, a great and holy Lent. And multiply this food throughout the world for those who are less fortunate than ourselves, as we give glory to you, together with your eternal Father and your all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.